President.
The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise in support of amendment number 859, which is a germane amendment to the underlying bill. It's one I introduced that would restore fairness, encourage competition, and prevent many states around the country from seeing cost increases in the price of guardrails. Again, this amendment specifically addresses the transportation bill we're talking about and addresses one of the new provisions in the bill this year that is a mandate that I think is not appropriate. A lot of states have infrastructure challenges right now, and the last thing we should be doing here in the Congress is making it more difficult for states to pay for their infrastructure with the limited transportation dollars that they have. And with the fiscal crisis we've got, we need to make sure now more than ever that states have flexibility to meet the requirements from the federal government. At a time when unemployment's over 9%, we have over 14 million Americans out of work, we also ought to be doing everything we can do to protect jobs. And this legislation would hurt jobs, and the amendment that I'm offering would give states more flexibility and help to keep some jobs. There are countless miles of guardrails around our country, and many of those are manufactured in my home state of Ohio. Those manufacturers galvanize the guardrails to prevent corrosion, and they have two options on the process that they use to galvanize the metal, as well as two options with regard to the thickness of the zinc they use in the galvanization process. In terms of the galvanization process, the first method is called continuous galvanization, where a company treats the flat steel with zinc and then fabricates the guardrail afterwards. The second method is called batch galvanization, where a company dips the final product in a zinc bath after they've completed the fabrication. In addition, there are two types of zinc thickness, type 1, thinner, and type 2, a thicker coat of zinc, which increases the life of the guardrail. A lot of states around the country, including Ohio, actually require type 2, which is the thicker kind of zinc for all guardrails, and that's due to the harsher environmental conditions that cause metal to erode more quickly. However, Ohio is one of those states that, although they require type 2, allows for continuous galvanization or the batch galvanization process, either one. Great surprise to me to read the legislation that's before us. Underlying bill says that the states are prohibited from using any kind of guardrail unless it's type 2 plus it's produced through this batch galvanization process. So it's a mandate, again, never been in this legislation before, that says it's got to be both type 2, meaning the thicker kind of zinc, and it has to be applied using a particular process. So it's micromanaging a process. And I will tell you, the life of a guardrail, as you can imagine, is dependent on the thickness of the zinc, but also the environment into which it's placed. And there are 15 states that still approve type 1. So these states have less extreme environments where corrosion occurs more slowly and the extra thickness of zinc isn't needed. So without this amendment, they'd be forced to buy a more expensive product that they don't want and don't need. By the way, these states are Mississippi, Virginia, Delaware, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, New Jersey, Colorado, Utah, Texas, California, Montana, and Wyoming. The U.S. Department of Transportation has weighed in on this issue. They have said, and I quote, "Requiring all galvanized steel to meet type 2 could add unnecessary expense for many states where the added thickness of galvanization is not needed. We know that type 1 galvanizing will protect guardrail components in many locations for the typical 20-year life design. The extra cost of type 2 galvanizing may be unwarranted," end quote. That's the U.S. Department of Transportation. The Ohio Department of Transportation has said that while they only use type 2, that ODOT does not have a preference with regard to how the galvanization occurs. Quote, "They do not have a preference for a particular species of type 2 guardrail, as both have been found to have very similar properties to one another. They would prefer that their flexibility to use both kinds remains intact." That's the Ohio Department of Transportation. They just don't want to be told they can't use the process that many of them use now, which is continuous galvanization. The primary manufacturer of continuous galvanization guardrails is Gregory Industries, located in Canton, Ohio. They were founded in 1896. It's a privately owned company, currently run by the fourth and fifth generations of the Gregory family. These guardrails make up about 75% of the business of Gregory, and about 99% of the guardrails they make are made through this continuous galvanization process that would be prohibited under the legislation. In addition, about 30% of their sales come from type 1 guardrails, which would also be prohibited under the legislation. So the language as it stands would be devastating for this one company and would put 125 jobs in their Canton, Ohio facility at risk. By the way, the guardrails they produce are approved by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials in a document called the M180 that dictates what's acceptable and what's not. The type of products for the current language, the type of products the current language would prohibit, by the way, have been in use in all 50 states in the country, and the continuous process that would be prohibited has been around for 50 years. So bottom line is, we shouldn't give this Ohio company or any company an advantage. We should allow competition to determine this and let the states determine it. Why come up with a new mandate that micromanages this process at a time when we're all trying to save dollars and use them more efficiently? So this amendment seeks to strike the language that would limit the flexibility of states and place additional costs in cases where it does make sense to use type 1, or it does make sense to use this continuous galvanization. So, Mr. President, I would urge that the Senate just take a common sense approach here, and I would urge all my colleagues to support this legislation. I know that my colleague may have some thoughts on this, but in summary, I would ask through this amendment to strike the language that would limit the flexibilities of states and encourage you to support Amendment 859.
I object to Amendment 859 presented by my colleague from Ohio, the guardrail amendment. However, I wish to inform him that we are trying to work out our differences so that we can move forward. But for the moment, I object to the amendment.
The chair is advised that it's not currently pending, so.
Unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside, and I call up Amendment number 859.
Is there objection?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, I thank my colleague, and I thank him for his comments. I look forward to working with him on this. Again, it's a simple amendment. It's a jobs amendment. It is perfectly germane to the bill. It's exactly the type of amendment I think that should not be blocked through this process, and I thank my colleague from Wisconsin.